The snow was a blanket of deceptive purity, muffling the sharp edges of the world. It lay thick and untroubled on the narrow alleyway, painting the dreary concrete and brittle winter bushes in shades of luminous white and pale blue shadow. For Yua, this alley, tucked between the back walls of her school and a forgotten row of old workshops, was the liminal space between her structured, predictable life and the messy, unpredictable reality outside. She wore the heavy, rumpled brown blazer of her uniform, the dark green and yellow gold plaid skirt brushing the tops of her knees, and thick wool tights. Her dark hair was cut in a simple, pragmatic bob, a curtain around a face that usually held a quiet seriousness. Today, however, her expression was softer, a little tentative, focused entirely on the creature before her. Yua knelt on the cold pavement, the toe of her practical brown shoe resting on the step behind her. Her backpack, a familiar weight of textbooks and anxieties, sagged against the wall, its emerald green fabric a stark contrast to the monochrome winter scene. She wore a pair of faded yellow-green gloves, the wool worn thin at the fingertips, and in her palm, held out with a careful stillness, was a small, compressed ball of something that had once been a rice cake. The dog was a mongrel, a handsome mix of breeds, with a coat of rich russet and creamy white. His ears were floppy, his muzzle intelligent, and his eyes, a deep, liquid brown, were fixed on the offering. He sat perfectly still, tail resting on the snow, his posture a study in patient caution. He wasn't a stray in the common, frantic sense. He was well-fed enough to have a certain dignity, but lonely enough to accept a quiet communion. Yua called him Kage, which meant shadow, a name given during the fleeting, late autumn days when she'd first noticed him. He appeared and disappeared without fanfare, a silent presence that seemed to haunt the edges of the neighborhood. She knew Kage wasn't a pet, no collar, no hurried owner calling him in, but he wasn't aggressive or afraid, either. He seemed to belong to the landscape of the city's forgotten places. "It's good, Kage," she murmured, her voice thin in the cold air. "My grandmother makes them just for you." Kage dipped his head slightly, a small acknowledgement. He wasn't leaping for the food, he was assessing the transaction. This was always their ritual. A moment of shared silence, a small offering, and then the quiet consumption. It wasn't about hunger for him, Yua realized. It was about trust. Yua was a girl burdened by the weight of unsaid things. Her mother had left 3 years ago, not in a blaze of anger, but with a quiet, devastating finality, leaving behind a profound silence that her father, a man devoted to his work and his grief, was incapable of filling. Their small apartment, always clean and orderly, had become a mausoleum of routine. Yua did well in school, her grades impeccable, her future trajectory already mapped out by her father's stern, unspoken expectations. A good university, a respectable career, a safe life. The pressure of this perfection was like a steel band around her chest. She had friends, of course, the requisite group to share notes and hurried lunches, but no one she could tell that sometimes, in the dead of night, she missed the sound of her mother humming, a forgotten, intimate memory. No one she could tell that she often felt like a ghost moving through her own life. Kage was the only living thing who received Yua's unedited truth. The alley was her sanctuary, the dog her confessor. The day she met him was a dreary Tuesday in November. She was sitting on the same low step, trying to puzzle out a difficult calculus problem, the late afternoon light fading fast. She hadn't seen him approach. He was simply there, a warm, solid form sitting a few feet away. He hadn't barked or begged. He had simply watched her with those wise, old eyes. She'd instinctively pulled out a piece of the sweet bread she hadn't finished and slid it toward him. He'd eaten it without a sound, then stayed, a comforting, uncritical presence until the darkening sky forced her to leave. Since then, she had sought him out. It had started with food, but it quickly became about more. She talked to him. She told him about the history paper she was struggling with, the envy she felt for the loud, laughing girls in her class, and the crushing exhaustion of pretending that everything was fine. "I hate that I have to be so responsible all the time," she'd whispered to him the week before. "I just want to draw. I want to go to art school, Kage, but I can't tell my father. He'd never understand." Kage had merely rested his head on his paws, his gaze unwavering, and in his quiet acceptance, Yua felt a permission to simply be that she didn't get anywhere else. Today, the snow lent a dramatic, theatrical atmosphere to her confession. The air was frigid, the cold seeping through the layers of her clothing, but the stillness of the scene held a kind of beauty. The sparse trees and neglected brush behind the dog were skeletal against the bright white ground, and the distant, blurred outlines of the city apartment buildings gave the illusion of isolation. Kage finally moved. Slowly, with deliberate grace, he leaned forward and delicately plucked the rice cake from her palm. He chewed it with a quiet satisfaction, his eyes never leaving hers, cementing the bond of their shared secret. "My dad. He told me tonight that he's arranged a tutoring schedule for me," Yua said, her breath clouding the air. She spoke to the dog's white forehead, avoiding his eyes now. "AP Science, every Saturday. He said I need to focus, that these are the years that matter. He didn't ask, Kage, he told me." A familiar knot of resentment tightened in her chest. It wasn't just the hours of extra work, it was the dismissal of her own choices. Her father believed that all of Yua's happiness was contingent upon his idea of success. She reached out a hand, slipping off her glove. Her fingers were instantly shocked by the cold, but she ignored it, reaching toward the dog's warm fur. Kage didn't flinch. He remained perfectly still, a statue carved of bone and muscle. Yua's fingers finally brushed the top of his head, a soft, tentative touch near his ears. "And the worst part is," she admitted, the words catching in her throat, "I'm a coward. I just said, okay, Dad. I didn't fight, I didn't even argue. I just let him choose my life again." She closed her eyes, letting the weight of the confession settle. The silence that followed was profound, broken only by the distant, indiscernible sounds of the city. When she opened her eyes, the dog was closer. He had shifted slightly, just enough so that his shoulder pressed lightly against her outstretched arm. It wasn't a demanding gesture, but one of simple, solid presence. He was saying, without a single bark or whine, "I hear you. I see your burden." This silent empathy was a catalyst. It was the permission she needed to stop feeling guilty for her own unhappiness. Yua realized in that moment that Kage was a metaphor for the life she longed for, unleashed, quiet, and authentically self-possessed. He didn't ask permission to exist in this space, he simply did. He didn't cater to the demands of a master. He lived by the rhythm of his own choosing. She looked around the alley again. The world she inhabited was one of prescribed lines and boundaries, the sharp edge of the concrete step, the neat row of the building wall, the narrow, defined path of the alley itself. Her father's world. But here, kneeling in the snow, she saw the softness, too. The melting snow where the sun had struck it, the organic, wild chaos of the winter-killed bushes, the way the light fractured and scattered off the crystalline flakes. That was her world, the one she felt a fierce, private pull toward. Yua gave Kage one last, firm pat. "I'm not taking that tutoring, Kage," she stated, her voice stronger, carrying the conviction of a new decision. "I need that time for my portfolio, I'll tell him, and if he's angry, he's angry. I'll just have to be strong enough to take it." The dog nudged her hand once, then leaned back, his silent message delivered. "Good." Yua took a deep, lung-aching breath of the cold air, feeling the familiar fear mingle with a strange, exhilarating sense of freedom. She stood up, brushing the clinging snow and dampness from her knees. She pulled her worn gloves back on, the act feeling like donning armor. She looked down at Kage. "Thank you," she whispered. "I'll bring you something good tomorrow." Kage stood, too, stretching his long, muscled body. He gave a single, slow shake, scattering a fine mist of snow from his coat. He didn't follow her as she turned toward the alley's mouth, heading back into the sound and fury of the city. He just watched, his posture patient and still. As Yua walked away, she felt the silence lift, replaced by a low thrum of determination. The conversation with her father was going to be difficult, perhaps the most difficult thing she had ever done. It would involve noise, shouting, and a disruption of the carefully constructed peace of their grieving home. But Yua knew, as she stepped from the snowy hush of the alley and onto the wet, slushy sidewalk of the main road, that the world was too vast and too beautiful to live perpetually in a shadow. She had a life to build, a canvas to fill, and she had just received her last, most important lesson from the quiet dog in the snow. Courage is simply the decision to act when you'd rather stay still. The weight of her backpack suddenly felt less like a burden of homework and more like the portable toolkit of her future. She walked toward the conflict, and for the first time in a very long time, Yua felt profoundly, fiercely, and completely present. The winter had just begun, but the long, quiet freeze in her heart was finally starting to thaw.